Being here. Appreciate this. Thank you, panelists, for coming and talking, and especially thanks for crossing the Great Divide. Yeah. and appreciate. I've missed working with John over there. So, but today we're rolling out our bicameral and bipartisan Harvest Price Subsidy Prohibition Act. This is a bill that would prevent taxpayer-subsidized premium support for what can be only referred to as a Cadillac crop insurance option. Now, to be clear, this legislation leaves in place traditional crop insurance policies that are provided largely at taxpayer expense to provide farmers from to protect farmers from anticipated and catastrophic losses. But what this legislation does is it puts an end to taxpayers being on the hook for a program that, according to an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, by Bruce Babcock and Vince Smith here, it would, and we'll hear from Vince later, it creates an opportunity for windfall profits. Now, in a nutshell, crop insurance policies allow farmers to recoup losses that they might have realized based on the price projected at planting time. HPOs are the same as a standard policy, except for one significant and costly difference. If the actual price at harvest ends up higher than the estimated price used to calculate the policy at planting, the revenue guaranteed is calculated using the higher price. And as a plethora of billion-dollar subsidy programs have come under fire, we've seen a shift toward creative ways to help to use the taxpayers to cover this guaranteed revenue. But instead of revenue insurance, I would simply call this taxpayer-funded profit insurance. Now, when the last Farm Bill passed, we heard a number of members say, hey, we're fiscally conservative. This Farm Bill is actually going to save the taxpayer money. Unfortunately, these claims have ended up being all hat and no cattle because of projected subsidies, and the projected cost of the program is higher than ever. Just to give you an example, when I went 2 years ago in, was it May of 13, and tried to amend the Farm Bill to take out this the taxpayer subsidy in the harvest price option, CBO had given a projection that it would save $9 billion over 10 years. But what we've seen in terms of that program and the cost of that program, just since that time, now CBO is saying that getting rid of the taxpayer subsidy for this costly program would save $19 billion. So we've seen farmers take advantage of this, and frankly take advantage of the taxpayer in an extreme way. This legislation is supported by a number of stakeholders, people like Club for Growth, R Street Institute, Heritage Action, American Enterprise Institute, National Taxpayers Union, Taxpayers for Common Sense, Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, Environmental Working Group. And let me just reiterate, this bill would simply stop taxpayer dollars from subsidizing the premiums of these HPOs. Farmers who truly want this exceptional profit insurance could continue to purchase it, but they would do so without subsidies from the taxpayer. And let me just call on John to come up, and I've appreciated working with him in the past on a number of fiscal issues, and he's always there on these issues, and I appreciate that he's here today.
Well, thank you, Senator Flake. And Senator Flake already mentioned much of what I was going to say about the savings and about the groups involved. I've been in Congress for 26 years now, and I very seldom have seen a coalition come together of a wider assortment all across the political spectrum of groups and people in support of our legislation. And certainly it's an honor to work with Senator Flake. I served with him in the House, and I remember in 2010, at the end of the year, the National Journal had a prediction about certain caucuses or groups that were going to serve in the next Congress starting in 2011, and they listed what they called a rabble-rouser caucus, and they listed Michelle Bachmann, Jeff Flake, and me. And it was an honor for me to be with you, Senator. I was sort of, I guess, the quieter rabble-rouser in that group, but certainly Jeff Flake did great work in the House and has moved on to do great work in the Senate as well. As you know, from 2011 to 2014, in just that short time period, this harvest price option cost the federal government almost $22 billion. Last year, premium subsidies supporting this HPO, this harvest price option, cost taxpayers $4.8 billion. And as Senator Flake mentioned, the Congressional Budget Office now estimates a savings under this legislation of $19 billion over the next 10 years. The largest producers, you know, this is one of those things that doesn't really help the little guys. You know, we do these programs thinking we're going to benefit the little guys. I mean, the Congress, for instance, passed the Dodd-Frank bill to get back at the big giant Wall Street banks, and before that bill, those banks had 29.5% of total deposits in the U.S. Now they have about 45% of total deposits, because what they did in that bill was hurt the little guys. And we passed these things in the farm bills and these subsidies supposedly to help the little family farms, but really most of this just becomes crony capitalism and helps the big corporate farmers. In one of the last years that we have statistics for, there were 26 policyholders who received more than $1 million in insurance premium support. 10,000 policyholders each received more than $100,000 in support. And by contrast, the bottom 80% of policyholders collected on average $5,000. And speaking about crop insurance more generally, 8 of the 20 largest crop insurance companies operating in the United States are foreign-owned and have been receiving multi-billion dollars in U.S. government subsidies to provide this insurance to farmers. They're guaranteed by the USDA a 14% rate of return, these companies in Bermuda and Switzerland. 20 companies in these other countries received $7.1 billion in taxpayer funds between 2007 and 2011. I mean, it's amazing what's gone on through this plan. So I am very honored and pleased. You're about to hear from the experts, but it really has impressed me that such a wide group has come together on this legislation, and so I think we can make some progress on this issue in this Congress. I'm very encouraged by it, and to have a great leader like Jeff Flake lead the way here in the Senate, I think is just a wonderful thing. So thank you very much for coming out today and for letting me be a small part of this program, and especially thank the experts who are about to speak and who have joined us. Thank you. We've got to get to hearings, so we're going to take off and leave the Minnesota issue. Thank you very
much. Who says politics is not a contact sport? Crutches prove that. So good morning. My name's Drew White. Thank you. Appreciate it, Mike. From Heritage Action. I'm one of the legislative strategists, and I've been there for about 3 years covering ag policy. And, you know, I just want to echo kind of what the senator and the congressman were saying. They've been great leaders on this issue. Senator Flake and Congressman Duncan have long led on reforming our outdated agriculture system. You know, one of the things that I think was instructive in the last Farm Bill debate, and one of the things that we were all kind of tuned in on, was the CBO estimates in terms of the new subsidy programs and how much this would actually cost taxpayers if crop prices dropped or changed. And when the reports came out showing that the cost was going to be much higher than initially anticipated, I think a lot of us were sort of chagrined by that, because we had been kind of predicting that. The experts at Heritage and R Street and Environmental Working Group and AEI and other groups, Taxpayers for Common Sense, had all been saying this is going to cost a lot more than what CBO is estimating. Please understand this. And there were efforts that were taken in both the House and Senate to try to curb the costs. So, and y'all have to excuse me, I'm going to have to actually leave quickly. So the whole thing that we want to emphasize to House and Senate staff is this. There's an opportunity with this bill to take a solid interim step as we move forward to curb the costs and protect the American taxpayer. You've heard the statements. It will save roughly $19 billion That's a lot higher than the initial estimates because the bill is actually going to wind up costing a lot more than initially anticipated. But the goal, I think, for all of us is we need to actually use this opportunity and use the lessons from the last Farm Bill, which was as everybody knows, a kind of a virulent debate on both the right and left, but use the opportunity to have solid structural reforms to America's agriculture system and agriculture policy. We're operating in a sort of an outdated Depression-era system, and we had the opportunity to use the recent CBO report, to use this legislation, and to really use some of the ideas that have already been put out there, whether they're free market ideas for crop insurance, whether it's just putting a simple cap on this stuff, to protect the American taxpayer and reform America's agriculture system. So that's where we're focused on. We think there is going to be an opportunity in the next few years to do that. I know the Heritage Foundation is very focused on research that will come up with ideas to actually provide an alternative in this regard. So Heritage Action endorses this bill. We encourage everybody to get on it. And this would be great legislation to pass, great bipartisan legislation to pass to curb the costs and protect the American taxpayer. So thank you guys for coming out. Hopefully Andrew and Dr. Smith and Mike here will be able to answer a lot of the questions that you guys have. I know they will be able to, and just really hope that we can seize this opportunity and protect the American taxpayer. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
I'm Vince Smith, and I wear two hats. I'm a professor of economics at Montana State University and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And I'm really here to respond to questions about any technical details associated with the crop insurance program and the harvest price option. It's a very difficult program to justify on traditional economic welfare grounds. As Senator Flake and Congressman Duncan pointed out, almost all of the subsidies, almost all is perhaps not quite the right phrase, over 85% of the subsidies go to farms whose net worth is in the millions and multiple millions, and households whose incomes are far and away larger than the average American household. So whether you're a conservative or a liberal, as long as you don't own a farm, you're not so sure that's a great way to spend government money. It's not really meeting a genuine economic welfare need. And there are serious problems with the incentives that all of the crop insurance program provide, including the harvest price option. The evidence is compelling from very distinguished research that it encourages increased pollution, soil erosion, the expansion, particularly in semi-arid areas, of production into fragile lands. So the real issue with the harvest price option, in addition, is that it's not covering the expected revenue losses relative to the expected revenues of farmers. As Senator Flake pointed out, you can buy insurance that will base payments to you on what you expected to earn when you've planted the crop, and that's the relevant number. Here, you're allowed to take advantage of any price increases in valuing your losses. And actually, we're giving people what are called free calls. In fact, we're doing worse than that. We're actually subsidizing them to buy calls at the government's expense, because the government picks up not only a subsidy for the farmer, but it pays all of the admin costs of the program as well. The farmer does not pay, does not make a contribution, for example, to the insurance company's cost for delivering the product, which is not like you and I when we buy car insurance, for example. And in fact, overall in the program, this is a useful thing to think about. If you got the deal for your car insurance and your car insurance costs $2,000 that farmers get, the government would be paying $1,400 of that $2,000 and you'd only be paying $600. That's sort of a great deal for everybody. When it comes to crop insurance and the harvest price option, for many farms, we're talking about numbers that are much higher than that. $3 million would be your normal bill, and you only pay $1.25 million. That would be a credible comparison. $100,000 should be your bill. You're only paying $30,000. The long run gains to the relatively large farms has been very substantial, and it's very difficult to justify on social policy grounds, We know that crop insurance is environmentally a problem, so it's very difficult to justify in relation to preserving the environment. And with that, let me sit down.
Hello, I'm Mike Lavender with the Environmental Working Group. Thank you all for being here. I just want to make a few quick points about the harvest price option and revenue policies within the federal crop insurance program. And I'd like to start by asking you to imagine for just a moment if your insurance policy for your car or for your house was cheap to purchase, yet so comprehensive that it paid you for losses and then some. You'd probably be willing, in this case, to take a few more risks than if you had a more reasonable insurance policy. Given the right conditions, revenue policies with the harvest price option do exactly this. They reimburse farmers for their yield losses at the harvest price time of their crop if that price is higher than was expected when they planted their crop in the spring. By some estimates, this outrageous policy cost taxpayers nearly $8 billion due to the drought in 2012. Because taxpayers heavily subsidize, as Vince mentioned, these policies, roughly 2/3 of the average premium subsidy cost, farmers bear relatively little risk when their crops fail. Eliminating or reducing these subsidies would shift some of the risk away from taxpayers and in the process save billions of dollars, help protect water, soil, and air, all while maintaining a quality support system for farmers. Between 2011 and 2014, subsidizing these revenue policies cost taxpayers nearly $22 billion. According to the Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Budget Office, reducing or eliminating these subsidies could quickly, as you've heard, produce significant savings. Furthermore, the Government Accountability Office has also said that these reforms may have a minimal impact on federal crop insurance program participation, which would ensure that the policy would be around for hardworking American farmers without robbing taxpayers at the same time. Finally, by eliminating or reducing these subsidies and shifting some of the risk away from taxpayers, farmers would be more likely to think twice about plowing up marginal lands or even plowing up new lands, both of which can be detrimental to the environment. So thank you for being here. I thank Senator Flake and Congressman Duncan for their leadership, and we look forward to answering any questions you might have.
I guess I get to back clean up today. My name is Andrew Moylan. I'm Executive Director of the R Street Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar, R Street is a free market think tank based here in Washington, D.C., and most of our work on the recent Farm Bill process focused on three key reforms. The first was trying to place sensible limits on the cost of crop insurance subsidies to taxpayers. The second was attempting to ensure transparency in crop insurance subsidies, as we had with direct payments. And the third was restricting crop insurance subsidies for farming on particularly sensitive lands. Of those, Congress only saw fit to enact the third, called conservation compliance. And so our work on the first two priorities continues. And along those lines, the Flake Duncan Harvest Price Subsidy Prohibition Act is, in our minds, a no-brainer. HPO plans are sort of a classic heads I win, tails you lose scenario for many farmers. They can reap payments in excess of what they anticipated while facing no risk of dropping below an established floor. And as has been mentioned, 2/3 of the premium cost is paid for by taxpayers in these exceedingly generous Cadillac insurance plans. In addition to that, taxpayers bear much of the burden of payouts in the event of a loss. And as Dr. Smith mentioned, they also pay for administration of those plans for being offered in the first place. So this, in our minds, is a common sense step. It can save, as has been mentioned, $19 billion, which is a not insignificant amount of money. I'll close simply by saying this, that HPO policies may well make sense for a great number of farmers who forward sell their crops in volatile price environments. And that's why it's important that nothing in this bill prevents people from purchasing an HPO policy. Folks are welcome to do that if it's a prudent financial step for them. But taxpayers don't necessarily need to subsidize those Cadillac plans. the farm safety net is supposed to be that. It's supposed to be a safety net to protect farmers from catastrophic losses, as opposed to subsidizing every potential financial scheme or hedging opportunity that farmers might employ. And so we commend Senator Flake and Congressman Duncan, who have long been champions on this issue and on agriculture policy reform generally. They have done exemplary work on that front. And so while the R Street Institute was disappointed with much of the recent Farm Bill, we're encouraged by this effort because we think it offers an opportunity to highlight these issues, to make some important changes that can save taxpayers money without gutting the safety net, without having some sort of catastrophic impact, and save a significant amount of money. So we look forward to working on that. And with that, I guess we'll be happy to take any questions that people have.
Farmers have already given up the office in the last Farm Bill, and they will oppose any cuts because the cuts already happened in the last cycle. How do you square that with what that's in this one?
So there's storytelling and there's creative storytelling and there's sometimes what the CBO is forced to score bills at. CBO was required to score the 2014 Farm Bill using a set of forecasts for crop prices, which even at that time could be most favorably described or kindly described as somewhat over-optimistic. And if you forecast higher prices given the current structure of the Farm Bill, you're going to get lower spending out of the taxpayer. Other researchers, Bruce Babcock, Barry Goodwin, and myself included, at that time looked at the price of corn and said $6.80 or $5.70 for corn is not going to last. What if corn sort of goes back to its long-run average of about $3, $3.50, which guess where it is now, around in that range. And then we ran some models that suggested that the two most prominent new programs, one of which is price loss coverage and the other of which is agriculture risk coverage, could comfortably cost $7 or $8 billion a year. This year, given where the price of corn is, given where the price of wheat is, yesterday, USDA's forecast for government spending for those two programs was somewhere around about $6.1 billion. In addition, some other programs included in what's called Title I of the Farm Bill, sorry to be so technical, but it's what it is, are going to cost around $1.5 billion. They were scored at $300 million, and these are the livestock disaster aid programs. Now, those programs are a little bit different because there were some exceptional circumstances. But the bottom line is, if you had scored the price loss coverage and the ARC programs at the sort of prices we're much more likely to see over the next 5 years than CBO was required to use, you're going to come out with numbers that average $5-6 billion a year. You'll get variations from different groups, but that's around the ballpark estimate. So the cost of those programs were considerably underestimated. The total savings forecasted for 2015 by CBO just before the Farm Bill was passed, out of the total Farm Bill, those savings were about $1.7 billion, of which $800 million came from cuts in SNAP, and about roughly $1 billion, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, depending on how you interpret the numbers, out of farm programs. There are no savings likely in farm programs at this time. At least that's what most economists that I'm talking to suggest, regardless of whether they're on the left or the right. And it looks like the Farm Bill is going to, in terms of farm subsidies, is going to cost a couple of $1 billion a year more, $1 to $2 billion, $3 billion a year more than the old legislation would have cost. The total Farm Bill, where you have about $75, $76, $77 billion tied up in food stamp programs, spending on that is actually likely to diminish. And so Congressman Conaway can get up and say we're on track for savings under the Farm Bill rubric relative to CBO score. But that's because the numbers for SNAP, food stamp program, are going down. Why? Because the economy is doing better. It's not the case that any savings on farm subsidies look like they're going to be achieved. At least that would be my assessment, and I think that's the assessment of most economists who are looking carefully at this issue. People like, for example, David Auden and Karl Zulauf. David is Virginia Polytechnic, and Karl Zulauf is a well-known ag policy guy from Ohio State.
One other thing, in a policy design perspective, the crux of the Farm Bill was eliminating, sorry, I figured I could yell loud enough. The crux of the Farm Bill was eliminating the direct payments program and transitioning most of those savings into an expansion of crop insurance subsidies. And so for as flawed as the direct payments program was, and Lord knows it was flawed, it had several protections in it for taxpayers, among them that I mentioned before, means testing, payment limits, transparency. And so we by and large do not have those protections for crop insurance subsidies. And so I think it's perfectly prudent to consider, I would love to see versions of those provisions move forward in this Congress to address those issues, but I think it's perfectly prudent to consider other types of policies that you can address to reduce costs for taxpayers in the crop insurance program, as it's now, by and large, by a large amount, the largest support for farmers. So it seems only natural, given that we've transitioned so much into crop insurance subsidies, that we should figure out ways to place sensible limits on the crop insurance program. I'd be happy to point you to Eric Onhold from Senator Shaheen's office, and we are remiss in not having mentioned that Senator Shaheen is an original sponsor of this, was a sponsor of many reform proposals in the Farm Bill process last time around. A similar amendment on the House side during the Farm Bill process last time around was sponsored by Henry Waxman, for example. I don't think anyone would accuse Henry Waxman and Jeff Flake and John Duncan from having a whole lot in common, and yet this is one of those things. So yes, there is some broad bipartisan support for this, and I think that that's an indication of the sort of sensibility of it, that it's something that can draw support from a very wide range of folks.
The president's budget says reduce total premium subsidies for the harvest price option contracts. So that's across the whole premium by 10%. The score for that is $1.9 or $1.8 billion from CBO. And if you look at the two scores, you see that they're very, very similar. And that's because their implications are very similar. There's not a lot of distance at all between, in terms of budgetary effects, the administration's proposal and the proposed legislation of Senator Flake, Senator Sheehan, and Congressman Duncan. All we have to work with are estimates. The estimates I quoted are from the USDA Economic Research Service. They make their own estimates. In truth, they're going to be more accurate than CBO, because CBO just doesn't have the resources that ERS has to put these numbers together. And CBO has to operate off of certain mandates that don't necessarily keep up with fluctuations in the markets. Most of the savings, I read very carefully Congressman Conaway's testimony and discussion, was it yesterday? And it was very clear that he wanted to emphasize total savings across the Farm Bill. It's certainly true that the CBO score and what is within the frame of reference for some savings. the score has gone up a lot for ARC and PLC. Below a baseline that's based on prices that were very unrealistic, yeah. But not really. And particularly, if you look at the overall discussion, the overall emphasis is on the total farm bill because of what's happening on the food stamp side, not because of what's happening on the other side. Now, the other area where there are some reductions, if you lower the price of corn, you lower the valuation for insurance purposes of an acre of corn, and then you lower total premium subsidies for that acre of corn because they're proportional to the value of the insured amount. So to the extent that there are, quote, baseline savings, they're not occurring in the areas where savings were claimed. They were occurring in the area of crop insurance, where we are getting lower estimates because of lower corn, wheat, cotton, and other prices. So that is, if there is any savings relative to what was forecast, it's out of that program, and it's because the price of corn, the price of wheat, and the price of cotton have diminished. So, for example, you're insuring your corn this year at around $3.40 a bushel, whereas in 2012 you were insuring it at $5.60.
Since you bring up that point, I'm curious that last year this exact amendment was scored at $9 billion. Yet, just like you said, the crop prices have come down, premiums have come down. So how did the score more than double if crop prices have come down?
Well, you got an, how do I want to phrase this? If I knew the black box that was being used by the CBO, I could explain to you how they came up with a different score. As I don't know what black box they're using, I can't explain why they've changed their score. Their score of, the score of $9 billion over 10 years was emphatically too low. Bruce Babcock estimated very carefully, for example, in 2012 alone, HPO added $6 billion plus to total indemnities of $18 billion that went out of the door, mainly to corn and soybean farmers for 2012. And so essentially HPO was 1/3 of the total outlay of federal dollars on the program. It was a huge contribution to the $14 billion or so that was spent by the federal government in 2012 on the crop insurance program. But I can't explain why CBO changed its scores. You'll have to ask them. I think all of this. Scoring is a game. And the better way to go about this is to ask what estimates are from people like the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute. It's clear that the Farm Bill was scored in 2014 in January in a way to ensure that the costs of the programs associated with farm subsidies would be minimized. Unequivocally, the numbers used to forecast the price of corn, the price of wheat, the price of soybeans were very high relative at that time to what was expected. In fact, a few days after the CBO score came out, using, what would it be, April of 2013? Price forecast, or price baseline forecast. USDA came out with estimates that were close to 2/3 to a half of the price estimates used in the score as their projections. There were some errors with that February projection, and those were increased a little in March by USDA, but still were way below what was used by CBO. Now, I'm not criticizing CBO. CBO was required to use certain prices, essentially. So this is not a criticism of CBO. But CBO has 3 people to do Farm Bill forecasting. ERS, for example, has, well, 80 or 90. And they're going to be paying more attention and do probably a better job than CBO will on average. CBO has to respond very quickly. That score of 19 billion came out very quickly, by the way. And it's lower than, I think, a number that people like Bruce Babcock would come up with for expenditures on HPO. I think Bruce's number, without putting words in his mouth, would be more like 3 billion.
I think the ERS data came out, what, 10 days after the?
The ERS
Farm Bill
data,
passed?
yeah, the ERS data came out on prices 10 days after the Farm Bill passed. Now, you don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to say something's not right when you get such a disproportionate difference between prices used by the CPO to score and prices that were A, extant in the market in January of 2013, and B, prices that came out in February and then adjusted upwards some in March out of USDA, but still well below the numbers that were used by the CBO. And please believe me, I have a lot of sympathy for the CBO. CBO pretty much had to do what they were asked by the House and Senate Ag committees. And so if there's a fault, it's not particularly with the CBO per se, but rather with the political process.
Can you put it in context as to what the cost of foreign policy is in relation to the entire budget, the entire federal budget? What percentage of
Well, you and I know that that's a small number. But waste is waste, and perhaps the better question to ask is the following. Who gets what and how much? And as Congressman Duncan pointed out, the top 15% of the recipients of crop insurance subsidies are receiving very substantial amounts of subsidy from essentially, if you do the numbers, $30,000 and up to over $1 million. If I told you that I was going to give Bill Gates $1 million in crop insurance subsidies and you were on the left, would that thrill you? And I think the answer would be no. And I think it's easy to say, gee, $23 billion, which is the total, roughly, spending on farm-related programs, is a fraction of a percentage point in a $3.5 trillion federal budget. If you apply that criterion, most programs that are wasteful, that shift incomes to people who are well off rather than in genuine need, would not be questioned. Some would, but most would not. So the very frame of that question seems to me to miss the real issue that an economist would care about, which is what are the benefits, what are the costs, who's getting the benefits, who's bearing the costs, and what are the consequences for third parties, for example, environmental degradation and so on.
I think it's also important to point out, and I think maybe we can talk offline, and we'll sort of wrap up in a minute here. I think it's important to point out, though, that there is no other industry of significant size that has this level of federal involvement in setting prices, in having dozens of different programs to address dozens of different perceived priorities. And so it's true that it's a relatively small amount. I mean, listen, when you stack up anything against Medicare, it's going to look real small. And so if that's the mentality, then we ought to be nihilists about everything except for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the defense budget. And on the rest of it, go to town. I don't think that that's a mentality that really any member ought to have or that any policy analyst ought to have. We ought to pay attention to all of it because it's all important. And this stuff is particularly distortionary. These are programs that have the policy that we're talking about here today has a lot of bipartisan support. It's a common sense measure that you can take to save taxpayers some money without gutting the safety net. And so, yes, it's a small amount of money, but that's only sort of trivially true.
the point is that
you mentioned at the end these other impacts. Could somebody talk about environmental, median farmer, land value kind of impacts of these subsidies?
I can speak very briefly to the environmental aspect of it. When you subsidize such a significant portion of premium subsidies for farmers to buy this policy. Instead of them, as someone mentioned, instead of them paying $100 for their premium, they would pay $33 and the taxpayers would pick up the rest. When you do that, farmers are more likely to plow up new land or to perhaps plant on marginal land because they don't have as much risk in the game. Plowing up marginal land, planting on new land over large geographical areas, and if enough people do that, can certainly have detrimental effects on water, soil, and air. And to your other questions.
I have a good colleague at Montana State, grew up on a corn, soybean, hog farm in eastern Nebraska. His dad comments about all these programs, and he benefits from them. He says they're driving up the price of land. Now, in the last 5 years, that's not the only thing that's driven up the price of land. The renewable fuel standards bears a fair amount of the blame for the roughly 125% increase in the value of an average acre of land in Iowa between 2005 and now, from $5,000 to $11,000 or $12,000 an acre. But his dad's point is this. A young guy coming into farming who just wants to sort of build from the ground up is going to have a much harder time with higher prices for land, and those higher prices are not unrelated at all to crop insurance subsidies, to the old direct payments program, which was tied to land, or the new ARC and PLC programs, which are also tied to land. So in terms of beginning farmers, if you look at the Farm Bill, there are two scandals, or there are several scandals about the Farm Bill. Biggest scandal is the failure to substantially increase spending on agricultural R&D in the public sector, which we know from work done by a myriad of scholars, especially Phil Pardee at the University of Minnesota and Julian Alston at University of California, Davis, yield a very high social rate of return by increasing on-farm productivity, not only here, but in the rest of the world. If you took the dollars, which are about $1.7 to $2 billion that we spend on the crop insurance companies to deliver crop insurance, and gave it into the R&D budget, you would double the R&D budget with almost surely immense long-term gains. The other scandal is the lack of funding, of any measurable change in funding to support the key needs of new and beginning farmers and the genuinely socially disadvantaged farmers that are extant in states like mine where we have 7 American Indian reservations. And what do those guys need? They are the people who need a kickstart in terms of education, in terms of access to knowledge, in terms of seed funding to begin their work, in terms of careful monitoring, which I have to say the Farm Service Agency has improved on in terms of its loans. But those programs were not expanded. As Senator Flake and Congressman Duncan very, very astutely pointed out, most of the monies, in fact, all of the new programs are almost completely targeted to larger, wealthier farm operations. I rarely use the phrase, I personally rarely talk about corporate farms. That's only 2% of all farms. There are a lot of corporations that are family partnerships. Your brother and you and maybe your sister have 3 farms and you operate as a corporation. Most of these are family farms, as Jerry Hagstrom sitting over there would almost surely acknowledge and emphasize, and rightly so. But they're very wealthy farms. They're farms, if you own 1,000 acres of land in Iowa for corn, which many of the corn growers do, that's $12 million in assets. And you're going to have averaged over the last few years $300,000 or $400,000 in effective net income. Is that someone I want to give a welfare check to? The answer would be no. What's the debt-to-asset ratio in farming, by the way? Well, it's 10%. I actually said in a recent article it was 11%, and I got a call from a colleague saying, you're wrong, it's 10, and I checked, and he was right. There's plenty of capacity within the industry to handle short-term fluctuations or even medium-term fluctuations in the price of corn, the price of wheat, and crop loss. In fact, in late March, I'm going to give a talk, and the title of the talk is the 2014 Farm Bill, an exercise in risk creation and risk transfer. The USDA at large and the farm groups in general have sold the public on the idea that all that the government is doing through its farm policy is providing what's called risk management strategies, helping farmers to better manage risk. The empirical evidence is that farmers will take more risk when they can hand off the consequences of that risk to others. That's what crop insurance actually does.
So we've only got a few more minutes in the room. We are happy to have discussions with you all offline. And so I think, listen, there's one benefit to having a microphone, which means that I get to talk louder than the rest. And so with that, I think we'll close the public portion. We are happy to have discussions with you all offline. Thank you all for coming.